everyone! We'll get to our regular introduction in a moment, but I wanted to take the time to pause first. If you've listened to this show over the past few months, you know we've referenced the current climate we're enduring amid concerns of COVID-19. A relevant topic emerged that we cannot ignore over the past few days: long-standing social injustice for people of color, especially Black Americans, at the hands of police brutality.
As content producers, we feel a responsibility to use our voices to ignite change and inspire others. We recognize our own privilege as white females and encourage you to recognize your own if relevant to you. Like us, you probably enjoy research and reading. It's at the heart of what we do on our show. We'd like to encourage you to take the time to seek out Black voices and educate yourselves on their experience. To be an ally, you need to do your homework.
We'd like to commit to including more diverse voices on our own show and within the Disney podcast community. We'll do our homework too and encourage you to share resources with each other. And with that, hello, and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 42, Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Emily.
Hey, Courtney, it is great to be back, and let's travel around the world today, but without leaving our living rooms.
I am definitely looking forward to it, and for this journey, we have a special guest joining us. Whether you recognize the name Jeff Kurtti, you've likely encountered his work as a Disney fan. He served as the creative director and content consultant of the Walt Disney Family Museum for a decade, and fans of this show know that I always enjoy my Disney bonus features. In my research, I found that he produced a lot of those. He currently serves as a freelance legacy authority and brand ambassador for Disney Parks experiences and products, which includes writing for the Disney Parks blog, presenting at D23 events, and even media appearances. You might even own one of his books on your shelf, which is what brings him to our show today. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, we're really excited to have you, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on our show. You have quite the career, as Courtney outlined, and an overall background working in the entertainment industry in a variety of roles, which Courtney mentioned, but also author, director, producer, creative consultant. So before we talk about your book, Travels with Walt Disney, can you just give us and our listeners some background about what makes you a Disney fan?
Well, I always go back to the traumatic incident when I was a child, which was I was 5 or 6 years old, and my mother took me to see Mary Poppins. And I'm told that I sat without moving for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and that the first thing I said when the house lights came up was, "Can we do that again?" So
Wow.
That was sort of the moment that broke my brain. And I think it was my grandmother ultimately who explained to me what a Walt Disney is, because of course I was so excited about Mary Poppins, and I got the soundtrack LP, and that was all I could talk about apparently. And then she said, "Well, you know how much you love Mickey Mouse. Well, Walt Disney did that too." I was probably, like I said, 6. I didn't know what a Walt Disney was. It was just words. So my grandmother actually goes a long way in explaining who he was and what he did. And I was sort of obsessed from that point on. And that was mind-blowing to me. But of course, I assumed that you had to be completely perfect and flawless and extraordinarily talented, and not just a mook like me from the suburbs of Seattle. So that really got me intrigued when I was probably a young teenager at the point where I figured out that real people actually made this stuff, and related it to the idea that that was a career path of a certain kind.
Absolutely. And unlike Mary Poppins, you don't have to be practically perfect in every way, as you said. As two former Disney College Program participants, I think that definitely resonates with Emily and myself. That realization, as you said, one, that Walt Disney is a person, and two, that you can work for Disney.
Well, that was just that sort of set me on my path. And I didn't have much of an educational background. I was in one of those, I think, typically lower middle class families where there was not enough to send all the kids to school. There was too much income to get certain financial aid. There wasn't enough to pay the bill. So I sort of had dreamt of college, but instead I just started working in just about any field in entertainment that I could get into. I don't think I had a realization at the time that I was garnering experience or meeting people who would be influential or building skill sets. I just knew that that's kind of the realm I needed to be in order to even make an approach to Disney.
It's always so fascinating to hear people's specific Disney journeys. So thanks for sharing that initial part with us. I kind of feel like, in a way, sometimes, kind of starting from the bottom and moving your way up parallels Walt's own journey, which we got to see a little bit of in this Travels with Walt Disney. But as we started reading that, we noticed in your acknowledgments, you noted the book's origins were from a presentation you gave on the Disney Cruise Line called Walt Disney on the High Seas. Could you tell us a little about that initial presentation and how it turned into this book?
Well, over the years, probably because of the sheer volume of stuff that I've done for Disney, probably it's got to be 20 years ago now, they started asking me to come on Disney cruise ships and give lectures and do book signings and meet with other passengers and be the sort of pseudo Disney celebrity that I am for their passengers on different kinds of cruises. I started doing repositioning cruises because I can talk a lot and I can talk about a lot of stuff, and they have lots of sea days and they like to put in really Disney specific content. So I was doing a transatlantic cruise, I think, and the entertainment contact at the cruise line said, can you do something about Walt that really ties to the cruise experience? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, Walt did some cruises. Sure, I can do that. I started to research and sort of it's like anything with Walt Disney, unless you think about it in a specific pattern, there's so much biographically on Walt that you can lose the threads. And so as I started to research, I realized that Walt and Lily and his family did a ton of cruises. He liked cruising. He was on a lot of different famous cruise ships. So I did this really fun presentation called Walt Disney on the High Seas. And as so often happens, rule number 1 of Mickey's 10 Commandments, know your audience. I had an audience member come up after I had done the presentation on Walt Disney on the High Seas, and he said, that would make a terrific little book to sell in the gift shop on the cruise ship. And I thought, that would. And the thing with books on the cruise ship is they have issues of storage on board, and they have big issues of portability for the guests. So they can't sell like big, heavy books. But I thought a neat little sort of soft cover something So I created a PDF from that keynote presentation, sent it to my editor at Disney Editions, who I've worked with since the beginning of my writing career, so about 1995. So I sent that to Wendy Lafcon, my editor, and she looked at it and came back and said, I love this, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's big enough. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, think of this idea. Walt was a world traveler and most people don't know it. Aha. There you go. That's a good idea. I said, and there's so much photography of Walt, getting on a plane, getting on a train in an exotic locale. Walt in Greece, Walt in Hawaii, Walt in England, Walt in Scotland. And she said, yeah, there's a book. Do like a travel journal. So between that and my editor at Disney Editions, that's how we came up with Travels with Walt Disney. And now you hold it in your hand.
I'm excited that you brought up calling it a travel journal, and that the inside dust cover of this says that. And I was intrigued that this is a lot of photographs. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, what is it you think about photographs that was a better medium to tell Walt's story of his travels instead of a more traditional narrative?
Well, I have a lot of ideas about sort of Disney books in general. Once again, I really start from a standpoint of trying to figure out who's my audience for this book. I realized with the photography, that was the best across-the-board storyteller for people who were either huge Disney fans, because I knew I was going to get into probably about 75% of the photos in the book have never been published. The second thing is I always think of me, the 12-year-old kid carrying around his first edition of Christopher Finch's Art of Walt Disney, the only present I got for Christmas in, 1972, I think it was. So I always think of what is the really hardcore fan going to react to? And then secondly, how can this appeal to somebody who really doesn't know anything? So it's interesting balance a lot of the times to figure out what story you're going to tell and how you're going to tell the story. And Wendy and I discussed early on and agreed that it was more interesting to communicate the scope and the methods of his travel and to really leverage the great visual imagery that we had access to as our storytelling method. As a longtime Disney historian and have written, I got a note last week that according to the archives, they have me listed as the author of 44 different books, including second editions and foreign editions and so on.
Oh, wow.
So I've written a lot of books. Ultimately, what I've gotten to in terms of looking at what my narrative is, a lot of books that are about historic subjects kind of suffer from procedural dullness. They don't really have a story to tell as much as you wind up like a Law and Order episode. You start sort of with that and you take the steps through procedurally, and that's the end. When I was doing the Walt Disney Family Museum, I got into a much more of a depth of understanding about communicating these kinds of stories because I was dealing with a medium that was completely unique. And utilizing your medium to its best advantage to bring as much richness as you can to the audience was really the choice. In addition, there are other means, as I found in the museum. Museum, you have an in-person experience, for instance. You're dealing with physical space. You have the ability to place objects and works directly in people's sort of aura. And I used to, once again, Diane Disney Miller and I used to sort of butt heads occasionally about, she was very interested in dates and places and statistics. I was interested in telling a story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that you felt something about. My whole goal with the museum, for instance, was to create a Walt Disney that you understood as a person, not as an icon, not as a plaster saint, not as a logo almost. So in putting together a book like Travels with Walt Disney, I had a lot of the same criteria. What's the most effective utilization of this medium? Giving opportunity for the reader to find out more in a medium that may be more suitable if they're looking for deeper dives, further information, more detail. So, for instance, I don't spend a whole lot of page count on Walt in South America and El Grupo, but I make reference to it in a way that will send a reader who's interested to look for more. And there's a terrific documentary by Ted Thomas. There's a terrific book that J.B. Kaufman did called South of the Border with Disney. There are other books that are more academic, more scholarly in tone, and that's the place that needs to do that heavy lifting. That's not my audience to a large degree.
As a docent in a museum myself, I definitely saw that museum background. I did feel like I was looking at a compilation of photos. I am a docent at the National Archives, so we only deal with paper. So it's really hard to grab someone's attention or give them enough information. And I really enjoyed how you did that with those captions, with photographs that, like you said, I got enough information that I learned about Walt, I learned about his travels. And I was also pulled and intrigued to keep going, which is, like you said, you want to do in a museum space, is keep moving in a direction of some sort to continue to learn. So I definitely saw that come across with my minimal museum background as well.
Well, and that's another thing. I could have told a linear story, and as I sat down to identify what the travels were, where he went, and what his means of traveling was, I looked at it and went, well, this is sort of a chronological bore. And all you do is watch Walt get old. And you're not giving the reader any ideas. So I looked at a different way of putting forward this story other than just chronological, and started to look at Walt's life. And ultimately, the book became more biographical than chronological. The great starting point we have is with Walt's youth, because he fell in love with trains when he was a kid. So that was a great place to start the story. Walt as a kid moves us into a whole section about train travel. Train brings Walt to California in 1923. California. We have a whole story element about Walt's travels within California and his experiences with that. And that just led our story along in a way that had something of a biographical narrative. It was a building contextual richness, so that the uninitiated reader is not only seeing Walt in different locales and different modes of transport, but is also getting an arc of his growth as a father, as a creative person, as a celebrity. So we were able to carry through a series of more sophisticated narrative threads, as opposed to a whole big chunk of text about blah, blah, blahs about getting on a boat. It was a much more interesting way, I thought, to put Walt's travels in a context of Walt as a person.
Absolutely. I feel like it really came through for both Emily and I. I guess maybe I was a third of the way through when I started to realize, wait, this isn't quite the chronological piece, it's the themes. And we've read so many different biographies throughout this podcast. It was nice to see a little out of the box structure to it. But what I definitely appreciated, having been well read and well researched, as you mentioned and kind of hinted at earlier, were how many new photos unseen were in this book. I think as a big Disney fan, it's a real treat whenever you can discover something that you haven't seen or had knowledge of before. So it seems like the photos were from various newspapers, museums, and archives. We love to hear about research. Would you mind sharing a little more about how you curated the content for this book?
Well, fortunately, I had under my belt one of the greatest curatorial experiences that one could ask for in my particular role in life, which is having been the creative director, content consultant, media producer, and company liaison for the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. That experience was the sort of macro research Disney project of all time, because one of the best assets that we had in the museum was that Walt was so photographed, so filmed, and so recorded over the course of 35 years that his presence could be imbued into that museum in many different forms. So I had done so much photographic research on the Walt Disney Family Museum. I had gone to the Disney photo library, and I think that I looked at tens of thousands of contact sheets, photo books, albums, looking for images, evocative images, interesting images of Walt. The thing that I had done on that project, though, too, was we had created an enormous database, saying a lot of those things much more simple on subsequent projects. So on this project, I thoroughly went through that database, and what I was looking for were visual cues, things that sort of called out to me that were visually interesting. So it was a combination of having a chronological list of all of his travels worldwide and a huge database, mainly from the Walt Disney Archives photo library of photographic materials. That was the foundation for the photo research for the book. Then there, of course, are other assets like paper ephemera, posters. As you said, some photos, particularly later in his career, many beautiful photos of Walt are not owned by the company. They were photo shoots for Look magazine and Life magazine and Saturday Evening Post and so on. Those tend to be in the hands of stock photo companies or photographic archives like Getty, and those you got to pay money for. So I had a fairly limited budget, so I was careful about what I took from stock. And that was really still wedded to the philosophy of what's going to be interesting to people. And of course, I'm a guy who's been looking at Walt Disney in books and magazines and everything else since I was a kid. So I have a pretty good instinct about what's really unusual.
Was there a photograph that particularly stood out to you from doing your research?
Oh, gosh. Well, there's one photo, for instance. We open the book with some photo spreads. There's one that is, and the opening photo spreads were meant to immediately put the reader in mind that there was a variety of things going on, variety of personalities of Walt Disney. So we started out with a beautiful photo of him looking very dapper from the 30s. The first big double page spread is Walt laying belly flat on the ground with his own camera, taking a picture. And there's such a strangeness. It's completely candid, unposed. He's got the happiest look on his face. And obviously is seeing something he wants to capture. And that photo, once again, the old saw of a picture is worth 1,000 words. What could I possibly have written in text that could compare to that photograph?
I really enjoyed that one. I'm sorry.
Isn't it terrific?
And I can just imagine someone else laying on the ground to get that shot, because the level that he's at, someone else has to be on the ground as well.
Somebody else either was, maybe the ground was lower where they were, or they were on stair steps or something. But yes, it's just a unique photo in every way. The next photo, opposite the title page, was really interesting because it's Walt dressed beautifully, but he's older now. He's not the Walt of the 30s in the very first photograph. He's 10, 12 years older, still dressed beautifully, overcoat over his arm, and a hat, as he always, when he wore a hat, has a sort of a jaunty angle. He always wore his hats Gene Kelly style. You know, he always had that right-hand tip whenever he wore a fedora like that. But he's standing in front of a building that has columns and a sort of cast iron pose. It looks very ornate. The photo had no ID in that it was just a random negative that was in the Disney photo library, and I wanted it, but we couldn't figure it out. So once again, took it over, gave it to the archives, a wonderful archivist there named Ed Ovalle. Ed was similarly intrigued because it's so cool. So like I said, there's Walt standing in front of this opulent building, overcoat over one arm, fedora on his head, and Ed said, he's got a shillelagh. By gosh, yes, that's not an umbrella. That's a shillelagh.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, okay, let me look at it. And he cross-referenced sort of his archivist mind and travel records. He's saying, okay, here's Walt. Shillelagh means Ireland. This looks like Walt is about 45. So he started cross-referencing Ireland and travels and all of that. And he found that Walt had traveled to, I think this is Dublin, if I'm not mistaken. And we couldn't figure it out. So God bless him. Let's talk about dogged and perseverant archivists. Ed went on Google Earth and cross-referenced the names of the hotels that Walt had stayed in while he was in Ireland. And he went on Google Earth and found this front of this building that Walt is standing in front of. And that's how we were able to identify the date, the place, and the circumstances of that photo. But once again, that's one of my favorite photos in the book, simply because of the degree that of research that I would like to take any credit, but was Ed in the Walt Disney Archives. There's Walt in front of the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin in November of 1946. And of course, he found out. And of course, the other thing, once again, you guys are caption readers, so you probably went, wow. But he was there doing preliminary research for Darby O'Gill and the Little People. This was in 1946, fully more than a decade before Darby O'Gill came out. So that's, once again, yet another tidbit of story that makes you think, what now? It draws you into the idea that there's much richer stories behind them.
I wanted to share... Oh, I'm sorry.
The other very favorite photo, you know, it's not a groundbreaking photo. It's not a never-before-seen photo. And once again, there are those in there, Walt on location in Greece for the moon spinners and things like that people really haven't seen before. But there's a photo that's on opposite of page 1, opposite the introduction page. And it's he and Lily in London under a sign that says Disney Street. And I love this photo because it appealed to my childhood. Because in Bob Thomas's Walt Disney biography, the first edition from 1976, I believe, that was a photo that was in Bob Thomas's book. And it always fascinated me. The caption in Bob Thomas's book just says Lily and Walt in London. But once again, a little more research, a little more digging. Walt looked all over to find out where this Disney Street was, and the photographer with him, obviously it was a photographer because the picture is too perfect with the map in his hand and the sign above his head. But one of the locals then told Walt that Disney Street used to be called Dunghill Lane. And of course, that appealed to Walt's very Midwestern sense of humor. And he told that story apparently quite often.
I feel like I need to look for that. I have family in London, and the times I've been, I've never known there was a Disney Street.
Disney Street, it's fairly easy to find once you know it.
Yeah, now that it's on my radar, I'm sure I'll be able to find it next time I go. I wanted to share my favorite photo because I think Courtney might have the same. I think we were on the same wavelength when we were reading this. But in your Hawaii Once More page, we have Walt in a hotel robe, having some drinks with Roy and the wives.
In 1939.
But the two photos below it of Walt in a bathing suit and a Hawaiian shirt. And it just baffled me because it came to my attention. I've only ever seen pictures of Walt in a suit or wearing long pants. I've never seen him in shorts. I've never seen him so casual.
It's interesting because it was one of those elements of doing the museum, which was the desire to humanize Walt's story and this was one of Diane's really big bugaboos. The reason she wanted a museum to begin with was she was tired of the erroneous information. And there were two extremes that sort of drove her crazy. She really disliked all of the evil Walt stuff. And we hear it still all the time. And it's all been debunked. And there's really good research. Walt was a racist. Walt was an anti-Semite. Walt was sexist. Walt was a money grubber. He was just a heartless real estate developer, blah, 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 blah. Once again, anybody who's scratched the simple veneer level off of that stuff, you find how wrong it all is. She hated all of that. There was one particular biography back, 25 years ago now or so, called Hollywood's Dark Prince. Ominous, huh? Just about, it was the evil Walt book. We always called it that in joking. My friends in the archives at the time and sort of the Disney fans that I hung around with. Oh, the evil Walt book. Yeah, she hated the evil Walt stuff. The other thing she hated was the deification of Walt. She said, my dad wasn't a plaster saint. He was a guy. And we realized very early on, much to your point about a photo of Walt in a comfy Hawaiian shirt and a swimsuit, it was his very humanity that makes him much more interesting. Much more interesting than a bronze statue or a formal portrait or anything like that. Walt in a bathing suit and Hawaiian shirt tells you a lot more about who he was. And those moments, it's like the double page spread at the beginning where he's laying on the ground taking a picture. Those moments of his humanity, to me, are always much more interesting than the very posed, very formal, very not Walt kind of Walt. And it's something that I've just tried to do at every time I get to tell a Walt Disney story. It's much more Walt Disney's story as Walt Disney and not a movie mogul or a brand or a creative genius. The stories of Walt as Walt are the real catalyst for understanding the whole Disney equation.
Emily was absolutely right that my favorite was that picture too. We kind of have talked about this in regards to biographies that we've read from cast members who worked with Walt, like Rolly Crump. You see him as the studio head, the cartoonist, and the creative, and we were wondering what type of Walt you wanted to portray in this book, but I think you just spoke so beautifully to that. It goes down to the fact that he was a human man, and that really did come through for me.
What's always interesting to me is to see that Walt was a man of no pretense, little sophistication in terms of how we think about that. We think about lofty intellectuals or people who engage in deep self-analysis of their own being, their own creations. Walt was, I believe, his deep genius was that it all came from within without that kind of self-awareness. Walt knew what good ideas were, he knew what he liked, and he trusted the people that he was putting his projects in front of, that they would get it too. He was smart enough to listen to his audience or to react constructively to responses and so on. But, Walt never graduated high school. He was not an intellect in the sense that we perceive an intellectual in popular culture particularly. His genius was innate. And the other thing is his genius was utterly self-confident. He had his flaws, he had his falling outs, he had his failures. But ultimately, he had a deep trust in his own instincts as a showman. He also, I think, and this is, I believe, where a lot of our love of the Disney culture comes from, he trusted us as an audience to sort of get what he was up to. And I think more often than not, his audiences really got what he was up to.
So I want to go back to what you were talking about of how you laid out this book to lead you to other resources. I feel like a lot of Disney fans, at least at a scratch of the surface level, are familiar with Walt's World War I tour in France, his Goodwill tour in South America. But I'm curious, from your research, which of his other travels do you think had a really big impact on Walt?
Well, and this goes back to the inspiration for this book. I really had no idea how he regarded sailing, how he regarded sea travel, ocean travel, until putting that presentation together and then doing even further research on this book. He found enormous peace when he was on an ocean liner, in many ways simply because nobody could get at him. This was sort of a world where, if he went to New York, if he went to London, there would be a phone message, there would be a telegram, there would be somebody. In the old days, when you were out at sea, you were gone. And you didn't deal with sending a Marconigram or doing ship-to-shore phone calls unless it was really important. And I think that was really, we all know about how he loved trains, but finding out how much he loved cruise ships or how much he loved ocean liners and traveling by ocean liner, that was really interesting to me. And then as he got later in life, two significant trips, one of which I cover in the book, and there are two trips when he was late in his life. One I could not find photographs on. It sounded fascinating to me, but I could not find any pictures. The only thing that I was able to find was somebody, I think, Paul Anderson from Disney History Institute maybe, sent to me a clipping from an Australian newspaper. But I came to find out that he had taken a boat trip. He had chartered a boat with his grandkids and had sailed, I can't remember where he embarked from, but he sailed in and went to Papeete and Bora Bora and to New Zealand. And this was a trip I had never heard of because it was completely personal. It had no business relationship at all. And yeah, here it is, October of 1962. He sailed on the Mariposa from Los Angeles to Bora Bora to Papeete, Tahiti, Pago Pago to Nandi in Fiji, and Honolulu, and then flew home from Honolulu. I found that absolutely fascinating. October 12th to 28th of 1962. I couldn't find a picture. Not a news story, not anything to represent it visually. And then his last vacation with his family was on a boat. They chartered a boat up in Vancouver, and it was he and both of his daughters and their husbands and all the grandkids. And he and Lily celebrated their anniversary while they were on that trip. And, Walt told Ron about all of his plans for what he wanted to do with Epcot, and that was sort of the last time the family was all together.
I love that this started with a ship and it's so integral to his own experience. But I'm curious, kind of stepping back and looking at these travels all around the world. Disney Parks and Experiences now has a presence all along the globe. And then, as you were kind of saying, we represent cultures domestically, like in Epcot. I'd love to know where else you see influences of Walt's travels shine through, whether it's in a theme park or resort, aside from Disney cruises.
Oh, well, certainly if you've been to or seen any of the coverage of Disney's Riviera Resort.
That's where my mind went.
Which just recently opened. It was very interesting because that resort was coming into being right as I was finishing this book. So the team that was working on photo research and our book sort of cross-pollinated, and they actually were able to help identify, because they were very specific in terms of what particularly the photographs in the Riviera, what they represented. And they found, for instance, that some of the photos that had been taken from the photo library had been misidentified terms of their locations. So they were able to correct some of the information in the photo library metadata, and as well as I was able to rewrite captions and some of the text to reflect information that had been essentially miscatalogued for decades.
That's crazy that it, even within the company, it wasn't on the same page there, but I'm glad you were able to get that resolved. I was fortunate enough to stay at Riviera on New Year's Eve this past year, so I really enjoyed just taking the time to walk through the hallways and the quick service dining location to see some of those photos.
Well, the other part, too, is you now have sort of a global presence with Adventures by Disney. And when you are putting together experiences for Disney fans, it's always a bonus if you can find the Walt connection for people. They love that. I had been asked before our current health crisis to go in October and do a Seine River cruise for, I believe it was either Disney Vacation Club or for the Golden Oak development, on behalf of Adventures by Disney, to go along and to think about content ideas having to do with doing a book signing, for instance, of Travels with Walt Disney, perhaps a lecture on some of the key locations that we would be near. And maybe we thought that we might be able to do some kind of walking tour depending on where we were going to port on this cruise. But of course, that all sort of went out the window with the cancellation of all of these events. But again, any idea that biographically, culturally, philosophically can tie to Walt Disney is always something, blessedly, that the company and the various divisions of the company always looks to as something that's desirable. That's why I've been doing a lot of work in most recently regarding issues of company legacy and culture, because unless we pass on really good information and help younger people understand all of this crazy alchemy, we're going to lose the thread. And it's really important to pass on the culture of Disney is its great strength. It's its great foundation. There's never been an organization, I think, that relies on, leans into its own, but not in a dusty way, not in an academic way, but more in an emotional way. And the fact that the company understands that value and sees that value is pretty important. There are any number of places and ways they could have lost that. But when you've got even the new guy, the new CEO of the company, Bob Chapek, his whole philosophy too, he says we have something that's the envy of every company, which is one of the strongest, if not the strongest brands on earth. Our strength in the past is our strength in the future. I don't think you can get more succinct than our strength in the past is our strength in the future. I think that speaks very well to continuing to place this sort of material, these sorts of ideas, at an important forefront for Disney.
I absolutely agree, and I think it's so great that it's inherent that heritage is such a big part of the company. It's
what I did a little tour thing for a group of influencers last year at Disneyland, and wound up having a long talk with the group. And I said, when you think about it, Disney, the culture of Disney is very much like a church. You go to this church to hear the sermons and sing the hymns and share the fellowship. And more than any other fan culture that I can think of, a lot of fan cultures are very possessive. They're very competitive. I don't encounter that in the Disney fan culture. The Disney fan culture is a lot about sharing. Did you know? Have you heard? Did you see that you can get this thing on Disney Plus now? The shared excitement and the shared joy is inherent in what I think makes a Disney fan. I don't think Disney fans who are those sort of collectors who go, I have all of those in my basement and I'm not going to show them to anyone. I don't think they last very long. I don't think that they make a lot of friends within our sort of subspecies of fandom.
I'll even say that those company values, I haven't been a cast member for about 5 years now. They stick with you. I had a student in my school do a research report on Walt Disney World as a resort. And when he heard there's a teacher in the school that used to work there, he immediately reached out to me and he asked me, he's like, what were the values instilled in you while you were working at Disney? And it came instantly back. And it truly does stick with you, working, being a fan. And like you said, it just contributes to that shared culture of the Disney
and the other
fandom.
thing is, I think there's a set of values that are applicable to everyone's daily life, or applicable to how you conduct yourself in the world, or aspirationally, even if you're not involved in an entertainment or a Disney industry, you think of those fundamental values of Disney about quality and value. You know, something's not just a value monetarily, but that it gives something that the consumer gains from having had the experience. They don't walk away and all they've gained is an empty bank account. They've gone away and they may also have an empty bank account, but they have experiences and elements that are new in their lives, and very often friends. I can't tell you how many people I stay in touch with that I met on the Disney cruise. I've met some of the greatest people in the world from my going and standing in front of people and yakking about Disney on a Disney cruise ship. And then I think that sort of that whole issue of creating a uniqueness along with quality and value are just, those are to me the core elements of what makes Disney Disney.
I love that you were able to make those connections even on your own travels within Disney, but I'd personally love to know, if you could accompany Walt on his travels, where would you want to go with him?
Gosh, I can't decide. This is one of those questions that's like two sides of the same coin. Would I want to go with Walt somewhere where he is constantly discovering something because he's never been there? Or would I want to go with Walt to a place that he loved? Would I want to go with Walt to Marceline, for instance, and have him say, this is where this happened, and that's where Doc Sherwood lived, and this was my school, and so on? It's hard because I think both of them would be exhilarating, just to be witness to that. I can't decide which one is more appealing. I realized I was doing a research for a project in Japan a few years ago. It was when Diane was still alive, and it was being done through the museum. So I was helping put the media together on behalf of the museum. And I talked to Diane and said, Walt never went to Japan. And she said, oh, he didn't travel in Asia at all that I remember. So maybe it would be fun to go with Walt and go to Japan.
That'd be
cool.
cool.
Or to China.
Do both. You know, you can go to more than one country on your trip. There's no rules.
But I just, you know, he had such there was a wonderment. He never lost his appreciation of things. He didn't become jaded in the ways that old men become jaded. I think he became jaded about things like business and money because they had just been sort of constantly troubling to him for a lifetime of. But he could still discover something that sparked that wonderment in him. So it would be interesting. It would be an interesting opportunity to go, where do I want to go with Walt Disney? Well, I'm going to think about that question for a long time.
So while you're thinking about that, you mentioned you have, according to the archives, 44 published works. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's really hard because we're counting probably the 3 editions of How Does the Show Go On, the theater book that I co-wrote with Tom Schumacher. Mm-hmm. There's now 2 editions of The Art of Mulan, but there's also a Japanese edition and I think a French edition. So there's probably multiples in there, but
that's still a lot of books.
Discrete titles, there's probably 35.
Because that is quite an impressive Disney library, and we like to ask our authors a lot about your writing, and curious, what is it about Disney that continues to motivate you as a writer?
There's always a story. Somebody asked me recently, how do your books come to be? And I said, well, there's typically a couple of pathways. I have been working with 2 amazing editors at Disney Editions for my entire literary career. Wendy Lefkon, and then more recently with Jennifer Eastwood. And a call will come and Jen will say, we're doing a monorails book. And that's it. You know, there are other books that come along that are a little bit more focused, which was recently, there's a sequel to Mary Poppins being made. We want to do a companion book, but we don't want to do a making of. Because making ofs are so hit and miss, and they don't sell the way they used to. And I said, well, let's do a cultural book about Mary Poppins, everything. From the literary origins through up to the making of the new movie. And then there are other times when I remember Jen Eastwood called me, when was this, 4 or 5 years ago, and said, what's the one that got away? I said, what do you mean? She said, what's the book that you've wanted to do that you could never sell? Or what's the one that started and stopped? And I said, Christmas cards. I've always wanted to do a book on the Disney Christmas cards, the corporate Christmas cards that would be sent out every year from the studio. So that's sort of the pathways that come. Or I'll have an idea and like Travels with Walt Disney. I'll take an idea and say, what about this? And then that's what happens. Because there's, like I said, there's a story to tell. I sat down with monorails because I had been assigned the monorails book. Basically, Jen was like, I think this needs to be a Jeff Kurtti book. She's also a big fan. She's a Disney fan, and she's one of my sort of big boosters in the Disney company. So I sat down with monorails, and do you want to know the truth? The story of the Disney monorail for a more general audience or a more Disney audience is kind of boring. There's not a lot of there. So I started to pick it apart into its philosophical entry points. What is this about? Why does the monorail exist? How did the monorail come to Disneyland? In a way, it was a lot like the Walt Disney Family Museum, which a lot of it I had to keep saying to people, we don't care about when, we don't care about what. We really care about why. Why did Walt want a monorail? Oh, so of course I handed in my manuscript and the basic components of the book, and Jennifer read it and called me a few days later and said, leave it to you, Jeff Kurtti. And I said, what do you mean? She said, you can take any subject and make it into a story about Walt Disney. Because that's what monorails wound up being. I thought the only entry point into this that is going to be of compelling interest in a narrative sense is going to be if you understand why. Because it's very easy to write down the statistics and go, this was the Mark I monorail, and this is what colors they were, and this is the, track length, and blah, blah, blah. And then you get into the land of who cares. The other advantage we had was an enormous amount of, and this is another reason to do a book, another thing to get excited about in doing yet another Disney book. My co-authors on the monorail book were Vanessa Hunt, who's in the Walt Disney Imagineering Art Collection in Glendale, and Paul Walsky, who's a longtime friend of mine, one of my best friends, and he designed my Christmas card book. So we started out this pathway as a sort of a hat trick. It was the three of us sort of doing it together. That made it interesting to me because I was able to reflect on and bounce off their perceptions about our subject matter. Vanessa was then able to find, and once again, never before seen artwork from the Walt Disney Imagineering Art Collection. And in addition, a lot of art you've seen for years, but you've never seen it right. What you've seen is a scan of an old photographic negative from 1985. You're not seeing the actual artwork color corrected and matched and so on. So that's another reason to get excited about a book, is you can put something out in front of people and say, look, you've never seen this before. Or if you have, you've never seen it the right way. Those are the reasons. I had somebody who was being kind of mean to me in an online setting tell me that I'd wasted my life studying Walt Disney and his work. And, stuff like that is personal and it stings. But then I thought, you know what? Because of Walt Disney, I've met so many people. And I've been to London and Paris and Barcelona and Shanghai and all over the world because of Disney, because of Walt. My whole life is a series of events that revolve around that. And if that's wasting it, waste away. Give me some more stuff to waste.
We are right there with you. I feel like, storytelling is the heart of what you do, and it's those stories that we love to share with our listeners. And what I absolutely love about what you said, storytelling is the heart of Disney, but the heart of those stories is why. I think that's excellent advice for our listeners. And I'm curious if you have any other advice for maybe aspiring authors who are happy to waste away with us on this subject.
Aspiring authors, people who want to write anything. I get that all the time. How do you do that? There's a certain rigor and discipline to writing. I tell people who want to write, just write every day. Doesn't matter what it is. Sit down, write a short story, sit down and write a journal entry, but try to make a space that's about writing. I have sort of a bed sitting room that's got my big wall of books, my workstation, a small bed. This is like my place. It's like I don't know, what's a Disney equivalent of a man cave? I mean, it's a study is really what it is. That's my place to do that stuff. Have a place, if you can, where writing is what's done there. The second thing, and you know what? It can be that table by the breakfast room window. That's my writing space. Give yourself 20 minutes a day. Some days you will agonize through 20 minutes trying to write. Some days you'll look up and it's 6 hours later and you've just been going. Don't ever throw anything away. You can finish with something and go, ugh, this is terrible. I hate this. Don't throw it away. Move it on to an external drive, make a printout copy of it, save it. Because it'll have some meaning at some point, another day, another time. Where you'll say, oh gosh, about 3 years ago, I wrote about my cat. I always feel, it's like you said, part of the family museum was constantly saying we care about why. And the reason we cared about why was my goal was to creatively, in terms of the entire experience, was to get you know the ending of the story when you walk in the front door of that museum. You know that Walt is gone. The important thing about telling a story where people already know the ending is what you can do for their thoughts and for their heart. And my key goal in telling a story is not just to provide context and create understanding and to entertain and to inform, but it's always nice to get people to feel something about what you're writing about. The Christmas card book, for instance, became about how the Disney culture and the emotional and cultural foundations of Christmas share a lot of similarities. And that became essentially the driving storyline of my Christmas card book. So if you're writing, there was a art historian and writer named Robert Henry, and he said the purpose of a piece of art is to elicit an emotional response in the viewer. And I think that that's true of any story that you tell. Because when you contextualize, when you inform, when you entertain, what you really ultimately want is for people to walk away and say, that was fun. That moved me. That was insightful. I didn't know that. Driving their curiosity to find out more is always satisfying. With the museum, I wanted to get to that last gallery and have people feel the loss. So a lot of the narrative rhythm and the placemaking through the museum is cumulatively so joyous and interesting, and it gets a momentum. And then intentionally we take you around a corner into a very drab room. And on a little TV set, you hear the news announcements of Walt's passing. And I've had more people come to me and say that they just stopped in that room and started to cry. Simply because it was, again, this reintroduction to Walt Disney and then this final realization that he was gone and he had so much more that he wanted to do. So to me, that's the storytelling philosophy that I inherited from Walt Disney and from the Sherman Brothers, to be honest. The great influences of my life are Walt Disney and Dick and Bob Sherman. Because these guys knew how to tell stories. And all I'm trying to do to a large degree is to stand in that shadow and try to do justice to some of that.
So our last question that we always ask our guest authors, we love to continue to build our bookshelves. So we wanted to ask, what is a favorite Disney book you have on your bookshelf?
I have a favorite Disney book that's been a favorite Disney book since I was I think it came out when I was 14, which is Bob Thomas's biography of Walt, because I always wind up going back to it. Because for what I look for in a biographical form, Bob Thomas's book to me is still the best. I have Neil Gabler's Walt Disney book next to it because it's a heck of a resource for dates and places and sources. But I don't find it as engaging as a biography. Are we talking about non-Disney books?
We're open to that too. We love the Bob Thomas one. We have covered that on the show, but even before the show, Emily and I both read it ahead of our college programs. So when it came time we had this idea about this podcast, we knew that would be on our list for sure.
Well, of course, I probably have 40 shelf feet of just Disney books.
It's like the dream. Beauty and the Beast library.
I think the oldest one I have some of the 1940 books that were done with the release of Fantasia. They did a series of gorgeous books through Little Brown, and they're illustrated specially for the books, and making of books, and memoirs, and philosophical studies, and architectural stuff. I mean, just on and on. There have been a million, about everything from films and television to designing parks. So I have a lot of that. And one of my kids asked me what I was reading, and I said, well, it's hard for me because right now I'm working on 2 books, and I find it very hard to concentrate reading when I'm writing. Mm-hmm. I know it sounds really odd, but reading for recreation is hard to do when you've spent a day researching, writing, dealing with text and words. It's hard to do.
I completely agree. After a day of grading 160 essays, I don't want to read.
Don't want to read
for my students.
I always say, yes, I would love to win the lottery and buy a beach house and have a really good coffee maker and a fireplace and a stack of books. That would be paradise to me. But I like just about, there's a lot of forms. I love reading classics that I haven't read, famous books that we all should have read that I haven't. I go back to favorite books from my childhood sometimes when I just need a break, or I want something to, lay by the pool and read. I go back an author in the 50s and early 60s named Elizabeth Enright.
Well, there's lots to add to our library there for sure, but your mention of classics sets us up perfectly for what we're excited for this summer. Emily, do you want to give a little tease for our next episode?
Sure. So on our next episode, guest reader Dan Heaton from the Tomorrow Society podcast will be joining us for our summer live action cinema series by reading Robert Louis Stevenson's literary classic and one of Walt's favorites, Treasure Island. This novel is the basis for Walt Disney Studios' first live action only film by the same title. The book also inspired the 1967 theme park attraction Pirates of the Caribbean, the Muppets' 1996 film Muppet Treasure Island, and the 2002 Disney animated feature Treasure Planet. Dan will join us as a guest reader to evaluate how those attractions and films compare to the original tale, as well as the story's appeal to a company like Disney. This book can be easily found for purchase online through Amazon or Barnes & Noble, as well as on digital libraries such as Hoopla or Overdrive.
I think that'll be fun to, harken back to a classic. I think it's been a while since we've done a fiction book that inspired Disney rather than a book about Disney, so it'll be nice to give that a try. In the meantime, you can keep up with us on Instagram and Twitter at Book of the Mouse, or email us with questions, ideas, or comments to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. Be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others may find our podcast and read and listen along with us. If you want to keep up with me, Courtney, I'm on Instagram at GreatGuthsby and on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Emily_McD. And Jeff, what is the best place for our listeners to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, currently, because I'm elderly, I am on Facebook. I have an author page on Facebook. I'm also building a website, which isn't quite there yet, but that'll be up soon. But once again, my author page on Facebook, I try to keep up to date on what I'm doing and what books are coming out and all of that.
Jeff will be sure to link your author page on Facebook, as well as, can you tell us what is the best place that you prefer people to buy your books? We'll link that as well.
I'm sort of indifferent. I tend to go towards, of course, because I'm a peace, love, dope, 1960s liberal weirdo. I always try to send people to independent booksellers or to specialty booksellers.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jeff. We always like to close our episodes with a quote, and as our guest of honor, that selection is yours. What do you have to share with us today?
Well, I sort of had two ideas because we were talking about where my books come from and how they get made and all of that. And it always reminds me of something that I was good friends with the Sherman Brothers for many, many years. And Bob Sherman said to me once, we were talking about how the Sherman Brothers music is seen as simple songs. And Bob said, yeah, it takes a hell of a lot of work to make something so simple. And I think that applies to a lot of what I do. I try to create entertainment and information and context and discovery in the work that I do. But it takes an awful lot of work to make it that way. And there was a quote from Walt where he said, the imagining was much easier to do than the doing. And I find myself sometimes chest deep in a book project going, how did I get here? The imagining was much easier to do than the doing.
Well, the doing definitely paid off, and we're glad you're able to share not only your work with Travels with Walt Disney, but your experiences as an author as well with us and our listeners today. Thank you again.
It was a pleasure. I really appreciate being asked, and obviously I can talk your ear off.
Not a problem. I think people have plenty of time to listen.
And hey, that just means we'll read another book and we'll have you back.
Terrific.
Book of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.